Our message today is, Are you trusting the wrong God? Based on 1 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 to 12. After the Philistines captured the Ark of God, they took it from the battlefield at Ebenezer to the town of Ashdod. They carried the Ark of God into the temple of Dagon and placed it beside an idol of Dagon. But when the citizens of Ashdod went to see it in the next morning, Dagon had fallen with his face to the ground in front of the Ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him in his place again. But the next morning the same thing happened. Dagon had fallen face down before the Ark of the Lord again. This time his head and hands had broken off and were lying in the doorway. Only the trunk of his body was left intact. That is why to this day neither the priests of Dagon nor anyone who enters the temple of Dagon in Ashdod will step on its threshold. Then the Lord's heavy hand struck the people of Ashdod and the neighboring villages with a plague of tumors. When the people realized what was happening, they cried out, "We can't keep the Ark of God of Israel here any longer. He is against us. We will all be destroyed along with Dagon, our God." So they called together the rulers of the Philistine towns and asked, "What shall we do with the Ark of the God of Israel?" The rulers discussed it and replied, "Move it to the town of Gath." So they moved the Ark of God of Israel to Gath. But when the ark arrived at Gath, the Lord's heavy hand fell on its men, young and old. He struck them with a plague of tumors, and there was a great panic. So they sent the ark of God to the town of Ekron. But when the people of Ekron saw it coming, they cried out, "They are bringing the ark of the God of Israel here to kill us now." The people summoned the Philistine rulers again and begged them, "Please send the ark of the God of Israel back to its own country, or it will kill us all." For the deadly plague from God had already begun, and great fear was sweeping across the town. Those who did not die were afflicted with tumors, and the cry from the town rose to heaven. Many people have warped ideas about God. The Bible tells us that God created people in his image, but too often we human beings try to create God in our own image. We have many preconceived ideas of what God should be like, and then we assume that God necessarily must be like that. There are many people in our culture who want to design their own belief systems, keep what they like about Christianity, but then mix in elements of Buddhism, Confucianism, New Age teachings. In other words, create a designer God. And this is dangerous. While it may appeal to our pride and our sense of spiritual sensitivity, if we try to create a God in our own image, we will be gravely disappointed when that God fails us during the difficult times of life. Now, there's much about God that I don't understand. There's much that I cannot explain. There is some stuff in the Bible that bugs the life out of me. But I have put my trust in the living God revealed in the Scriptures, and I have found that when I go through the tough times, he has always been there for me. Now, last week we looked at rabbit's foot religion, our tendency to try to control God and get him to do for us whatever we want him to do. We think of God as nothing more than a good luck charm or a celestial errand boy, and we engage in religious extortion to twist his arm and have him do things our way. We're going to see today in this text that God is not controlled by anyone. He is the sovereign, almighty Lord of the universe, and all false gods must bow to him. When we look at 1 Samuel chapter 5, we can see the supremacy of the true God. The author sets up a sharp contrast in this passage between the impotence of the false god and the almighty hand of God. The Philistines had captured the Ark of God and set it up in the temple of their deity Dagon, probably a vegetation or a grain god. Some think that he was the so-called father of Baal, and others think that he was a fish god. Now, we have to understand what the Philistines must have been thinking at this time. It was the custom in the ancient Near East to carry off the so-called gods of the conquered nation and deposit them in places of worship at home. And so the Philistines took the Ark of God and placed it below the image of Dagon to symbolize that Israel's God was in subjection to Dagon, that Israel's God was the defeated God and Dagon was the victorious one. But in reality, God is the only Almighty One and reigns supreme over all. What we can see in this text is that a false god cannot stand in the presence of the true God. The next morning, before Dagon had his Wheaties, he had fallen on his face before the Ark of God. In other words, what it was representing is that Dagon was bowing before the true God. So the Philistines took Dagon and set him back in his place. Can you imagine how the Israelites responded when they heard this? I'm sure there was some holy, uproarious laughter. Hey, Philistines, your God needs help getting up. What you gonna do, go around dragging Dagon? I think I heard Dagon say, I've fallen and I can't get up. Could we get him to do some commercials for Medic Alert? We have to remember that if your God falls down, you're trusting the wrong God. And if you need to help your God back up, you're trusting the wrong God. And it gets worse for this vegetation god, fish god, whatever you think, whatever Dagon was. It gets worse because we can see that the next night the impotent God is mutilated. We find that in verses 4 and 5. The next morning, before Dagon had his Wheaties, he was knocked again to the ground, and this time his head and his hands were broken off. This was Humpty Dumpty for sure, and apparently in this case as well, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Dagon together again. Dagon was having all his godness knocked out of him, and no great crazy glue could hold him together. What kind of God is that needs to be helped back up, has no head to be aware of the needs of his people, has no hands to help them in their troubles? He couldn't do it before, certainly could not now. So we have to remember that if your God needs crazy glue to put his head and his hands back on, you're trusting the wrong God. Isn't it interesting that this revelation to the Philistines did nothing to move them to repentance? Instead, they developed a new religious tradition. Never step on that threshold of that temple because you might step on a place where the pieces of their idol had lain. Remember that if you try to develop new religious traditions, instead of repenting of your ignorance, you're trusting the wrong God. Listen to how the Psalms describe idols. In Psalm 115, our God is in the heavens, and he does as he wishes. Their idols are merely things of silver and gold shaped by human hands. They have mouths, but they cannot speak, and eyes, but they cannot see. They have ears, but cannot hear, and noses, but cannot smell. They have hands, but cannot feel, and feet but cannot walk, and throats but cannot make a sound. And those who make idols are just like them, as are all who trust in them. Notice in this text the severity of the true God. We have to understand that the casual, laid-back, tolerant God does not exist. This was no tame God the Philistines thought that they had conquered. Yes, they had captured his ark, but in reality they had been captured by God. And God was pouring out his wrath upon these pagans so that they would not miss the point that he was real, and they needed to turn their hearts back to him. And so this awesome God, this severe God, brought physical suffering upon them. He struck the people of Ashdod with tumors, which caused great suffering. A later verse speaks of rats that invaded the land. It's believed that this plague of rodents caused an outbreak of bubonic plague, and it infected a large percentage of the population. Such a plague would cause fevers and painful swelling under the skin, but their suffering did not encourage them to call upon God. Notice who the Philistines cried out to in their distress. In verses 8 and 11, it tells us that they cried out to their rulers, but the rulers did not know what to do. And so their only plan was to move the ark to another city. It was in Ashdod, but they said, well, let's move it to Gath, which they did. And all that did was it spread the plague and death around the country. I guess they thought that there should be equal opportunity plagues. So it not only brought distress to them and disease and suffering, but it also brought panic in verse 9. The people of Gath knew what had happened in Ashdod when the ark was there, and they were terribly frightened when those same outbreaks of tumors began afflicting them. And their only hope was to get rid of the ark as fast as they could. Well, this also brought death. In verses 10 to 12. When Gath sent the ark to Ekron, the Ekron Chamber of Commerce met the transport party with no way, no how. In verse 12, it says that the outcry of the city went up to heaven. They finally got the picture and began to cry out to God. Now, we don't know if it was to their false gods or if they were crying out to the God of Israel. We really don't know for sure. But all in all, the ark was in Philistine territory for a total of 7 months. Everyone was convinced that they needed to get this ark out of their country and fast. The funeral directors were getting way too much business. But think about it, 7 months? What took them so long? Well, if you take a look at the next chapter, chapter 6, it tells us that they prepared a cart, put in the cart 5 gold rats and 5 gold tumors along with the Ark of the Covenant, and hitched it up with 2 cows with suckling calves. They were going to see if this really was the hand of God that brought all this devastation upon them, or if it was just incredible bad luck. Now, we know that the cows, which by nature would have gone back to their calves, even city boys like me know that, those cows took the cart straight down the road to Beth Shemesh in Israelite territory. God wanted them to know, he wanted the Philistines to know, in no uncertain terms, that he was the one who had destroyed their gods, their lands, and their bodies. So what would these Philistines do with that kind of revelation? Would they turn from their idolatry to serve this obviously real and powerful God? Or would they simply take Dagon into the local image shop for repairs? Maybe they would fund research and development on rat pesticides. Maybe some of them slapped bumper stickers on their chariots, "I survived the plague of 1070. And probably many of them just sighed, "Well, I'm glad that's over," and went back to their daily routines. You know, many of us tend to respond to the immediate pain, and they fail to see the truth of a situation. And once our fears are taken care of and our pain is gone, our heads are no wiser and our hearts are no softer. Perhaps the Egyptians and the Philistines have no corner on denseness or ignorance. God does not conform to our expectations of an easygoing God who just loves everybody no matter what they do. This God is not the man upstairs, but he is the almighty ruler of the universe. So let me ask you today, in what kind of God are we trusting? The true God of our lives is that to which we are single-mindedly devoted, that which consumes our thoughts and our affections. An idol can become a substitute for the true God in our lives, or we think that it is. So let me ask you something. We're not talking about some stone idol that we have in a corner of our house, or some silver image that we bow down to. But there are so many different idols that we deal with in our culture today. On this illustration, it shows career, family, money, culture, power, approval, possessions, comfort, success, fame, religion, entertainment, and yourself. All of those are possible idols, things that would take the place in our hearts of the true God. So let me ask you a few things. For some, is our 401k our God? Maybe we're not bowing down and saying, "Oh, almighty 401k, I'm trusting that you will take care of me and preserve me through what I hope will be a long retirement." And then the stock market takes a plunge and you discover you're trusting in the wrong God. For some, a hobby can become their God, something that is good and enjoyable and brings much pleasure to the heart, but slowly and surely the hobby starts to take precedence over everything else, family, friends, work, even church, and it becomes more of an obsession, and you discover you're trusting in the wrong God. For many, their bank account is their God. But what a weak, powerless God money is. You have to protect it. You can lose it. It may give us temporary pleasure, but we are never satisfied with how much we have. And some smart guy will one day hack into the account and clean you out, and you discover that you're trusting in the wrong God. For some, fame is their God. We live our lives for the adoration of other people. All we want is to be recognized for who we are and what we do. We want people to know our name. But when our 15 minutes of fame is over, we discover we're trusting in the wrong God. For some people, a spouse or a boyfriend or a girlfriend is their God. But someday we discover that the one we thought loved us actually loves someone else, and we discover we're trusting in the wrong God. I want to read again from Psalm 115, how it describes idols. Our God is in the heavens, and he does as he wishes. Their idols are merely things of silver and gold, shaped by human hands. They have mouths, but cannot speak, and eyes, but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, and noses but cannot smell. They have hands but cannot feel, and feet but cannot walk, and throats but cannot make a sound. And those who make idols are just like them, as are all who trust in them. Folks, we have a God who speaks. He has spoken through the apostles and the prophets and through his Son Jesus. We have a God who sees. He saw the condition we were in as human beings and was moved to help us. We have a God who hears every cry of our hearts. We have a God who smells the prayers of our hearts, and the sacrifices we make for him are like a fragrant incense to him. And we have a God with feet. He walked to Calvary, bearing his cross. We have a God who has hands, hands that were nailed to that cross as the one perfect sacrifice for sins. We have a God who has a throat, and when his work on the cross was done, cried out, "It is finished." We're trusting in a God who is so powerful that 3 days after Jesus died, he raised Christ from the dead, and 40 days later, Jesus ascended to the right hand of his Father, from which throne he is reigning over his people and interceding for them, listening to the prayers of his people, directing the mission of his people, healing and comforting and empowering and sustaining and preserving his people. And someday he will return to judge the living and the dead. That is the God in whom we are trusting. He is the only one who deserves our single-minded devotion. He is the only one who is worthy of our love and affection. And he's the only one who has shown himself to be supreme and powerful and faithful and worthy of our trust. There is no one like him in all this universe, and we owe our total allegiance to him. Amen.